All right. Well, my computer tells me that it is 10 a.m. Pacific, and so I'd like to officially begin and welcome you to our very first partnership webinar between NAI, PUP, TAPAS, and I'm quite delighted to have all of you join us. My name is Emily Jacobs. I'm the Certification and Training Program Manager for the National Association for Interpretation. And this is part of a PUP NAI webinar series. It's also part of a TAPAS webinar series. The next PUP NAI webinar is actually going to be this Wednesday, and those are in Spanish. We're doing a series, Jon is doing a series called How to Craft Strong Interpretive Themes According to the Theory of Sam Ham. And so you can still register for those if you are interested. You can register through NAI's website, or you can also register through PUP's website. It's a two-part series with the first happening this Wednesday, the next one happening the Wednesday after. NAI also has a webinar tomorrow. We're getting a lot of use out of this room this week. And our webinar is about utilizing controversy and how to interpret controversy using non-personal interpretation. So if you're interested in that, that's tomorrow at the same time. This webinar that we're here today to be part of is called More Than Just Design, Designing Interpretive Experiences for Heritage Management. And this particular session will have a wide variety of presenters. You can see their photographs on the bottom. I'm going to just quickly introduce themselves and let you know their titles. And then each of them are going to turn their webcam on and tell you a little bit about themselves. So first, we're going to have Tiago Sousa. He is the Chair of Capacity Building for TAPAS. And I'm actually going to turn my webcam off so that he can tell you a little bit about TAPAS and about himself. And then we'll introduce Jon.
Hello, Emily. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
My name is Tiago. I'm from Brazil, and I'm representing the TAPAS group. I don't know if you can show the slides from TAPAS.
Yes.
Or myself, I can.
But not yet.
Should I move the slides?
Yes, you can do that.
Okay.
We'll introduce ourselves afterwards.
Oh, okay. So my name is Tiago. I'm representing TAPAS group, and we are doing this webinar in the Global Heritage Consortium is doing the webinar in NAI in partnership with TAPAS. And we are a group of professionals and academics, and our vision is to advocate for a future where tourism enhances the conservation integrity of protected area systems. So we work with tourism and protected areas. We aim to improve human well-being of the communities and protected areas managers. We aim to provide accessible, inspiring, safe, and educational opportunities for tourists, for visitors. And we aim to promote environmentally, social, cultural, and economically sustainable experiences for the tourists, the communities, and the staff and managers of these protected areas. We are a commission from the IUCN, from the World Commission of Protected Areas, WCPA. We are all a team of voluntary people. Jon participates in this group as well. And we are specialists on tourism and protected areas and of particular importance for biodiversity. We promote a lot of develop knowledge through guidelines and books. Here you can see some of the books that we developed, and you can have access to those books in our website in IUCN. Right now we are developing another one about economic impact analysis in tourism protected areas. We also working with the series of webinars to promote capacity development. We have been done webinars in visitor use management framework, in concessions, and over tourism, and now this one about interpretation. We also promote networking, and we normally get together in those big events around the world. Next meeting, we're going to have one in the Latin America conference of protected areas next March in Peru. And our structure, our chair leader is Anna Spenceley. She is responsible for strategy and fundraising. Our vice chair is Sue Sinman. She works with communities and heritage. We have Yufei Long working in a group of biodiversity. And Barbara Engels, she's responsible for the economics task force. We have been working with Megan in our knowledge development till now. And I'm responsible for the capacity building task force and the webinars. We also have Sergey Shiroki working with our membership, Jeremy Sampson in communications, and Julia Carbone as IUCN focal point. These are some links for our communications platforms. We use a lot of Facebook, and you can access our website in IUCN website, and you can learn more about the TAPAS group. Thank you, Emily, for the opportunity for working together, and I give you back to the stage for the others to present and start the webinar. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Tiago. So John's photo is up, so I will have him turn his webcam on. But Jon Kohl is the President and Executive Director of the PUP Consortium.
Yep, I am also part of the organization team for the webinar series with NAI in Spanish about themes related to interpretation. And in fact, the webinar that's coming up in a couple of days was actually mine, based on a new book about developing strong interpretive themes. The only other thing I would mention at this point is that I'm the co-organizer of the first Latin American Congress on Heritage Interpretation, which just concluded 2 days ago. We were very excited. It was a teleconference among 5 different countries, and some 1,700 people signed up for that online. Back to you.
That's fantastic, John. Actually, why don't we have Marisol introduce herself? Do you want to keep your webcam on, or is she at a different station? There she is. This is Marisol Mayorga. She is also a member of the PUP team. Good morning. And she's a professor at the University of Costa Rica in ecological tourism. So Marisol, you want to give a short introduction?
Well, I think you already did. But yeah, I'm a professor here at the University of Costa Rica. I am also a doctorate student at Kansas State University under Dr. Ted Cable, who has inspired many interpreters around the world. And here we are collaborating with PUP and NAI and TAPAS.
All right. Thank you, Marisol. Our last presenter today is Clark Hancock. He is also a member of the PUP Consortium. He's the treasurer. So I'll let him turn on his webcam and see if there's anything else he'd like to add.
Not really. I'm Clark Hancock. I'm an interpretive consultant in Austin, Texas in the United States. I'm a certified interpretive trainer, part of the PUP executive team, and thank you all for this opportunity. We'll have a great time today. And back to you.
All right. Well, now we've had an opportunity to get to know our panel of folks, as well as get a little bit of an introduction about TAPAS. I will turn it over to John, who's going to talk a little bit more about interpretation and interpretive planning.
Okay, I'm going to leave off the camera because there are people who oftentimes don't have enough bandwidth, so this will make it easier for them, but hopefully you can all hear me fine. And I'd like to start off this webinar with a question. Here you see 3 different interventions here in this picture, a sign, a guided walk, and an exhibit with an animatronic dinosaur. So let me ask you this, and you can quickly vote. Which one of these 3, put it out of the way, best represents interpretation? I'll give you 30 seconds to start voting now. Okay, we got 3. Look at here coming in. 19 participants, and we got 10, 11, 13. All right. I think that's just about everybody has voted. Can people see the results right now? Emily?
Yes,
Okay,
we can.
they can. All right.
We can.
So,
We can see the same thing you see. Yep.
most people chose guided walk. But in fact, I would say that none of these are examples of interpretation, because media themselves aren't actually interpretive at all. Interpretation doesn't lie in the physical exterior media that we see when we go through parks and museums. So in fact, tourism oftentimes manages these physical exterior parts of what I call an experience opportunity, which include where do the visitors go, what do they see, what are the tools that they use. These exterior dimensions also include the signs, exhibits, trails, the food that the visitors eat, the customer service that they report. These are all exterior conditions. And this is usually where tourism providers focus. This is where graphic designers focus, interior decorators, perhaps even architects when you walk into a visitor center. But there's far more to the experience than just the exterior dimension. And to demonstrate that, let me do a thought experiment with you all, okay? So let's imagine that we're in front on a raft, and we're looking back at another raft in our trip, and you can see that there are several people on that raft. There's a husband and wife in the front. All the conditions are the same. They're in the same river, they're in the same boat, the same weather conditions. Everything is the same except one of them is on one side of the boat and the other one is on the other side of the boat. But look at their faces. The gentleman on the right, he's got a facial expression of sheer terror, while his wife on the left seems to be really enjoying herself. So the question is, how is it possible that if every condition is exactly the same, they can have totally different experiences? This is why I use the term visitor experience opportunity rather than just experience, because tourism providers and interpreters, we literally can't design, offer, we can't even guarantee experiences. Because where do experiences happen? If anybody wants to quickly put in the chat room, where do experiences happen? That we can't guarantee them, design them, or offer them directly. Anyone take? I see Tommy has an idea, or Tammy. Exactly. In the visitor's mind, these are the interior dimensions. Experiences are perceptual, they're psychological, they're based on what every guest or visitor brings to a place or an opportunity, like their values, their beliefs, their expectations. So if we're going to manage experiences of visitors at heritage places, we have to manage more than just the exterior. We have to be able to manage the interior dimensions also that influences people's experiences that people create. This is where interpreters work, fiction writers, artists, psychologists. So what interpreters really do is they facilitate great experiences, so that because great experiences burn positive memories into our minds. And when we have positive memories in our minds, guests, we all tend to create positive attitudes about the heritage that we're visiting. And hopefully then we're even more disposed or open to participate in the management and protection of the heritage that we're visiting and experiencing. So if you look at it this way, in fact, interpreters don't really teach anything. We're not teachers. That's not our job. What we do is we facilitate, we help to form these deeper positive relationships between people and heritage, people and places. It's people oftentimes surprised when I say that, but it's a lot like what a spiritual teacher does. A spiritual teacher tries to facilitate or mediate a deeper relationship between the person who's, say, meditating and all of the universe, all of creation. So this deep relationship depends on people thinking about their relationship to the interpreted heritage. So if our interpretation is good, people are going to think a lot about that, the heritage, and they're going to create connections between their own background, their own experience, and the place that they're visiting. And the more connections they make, the deeper, the more the deeper the connection, the more profound their connection is, and the deeper their relationship is to that heritage. And hopefully they're making positive connections, so they have a positive relationship. So the art of interpretation isn't just grabbing and holding attention. Here's somebody who's developing positive attitudes. But because any theme park can grab and hold attention. But the difference is, while we hold and grab their attention, we're provoking people to think more deeply about what heritage means to them and what it means about the universe. So, is interpretation a sign, an exhibit, a trail? No, it's none of these things. Interpretation is actually a communication process that deepens relationships. Or as Marisol often says, it's the function of the Cupid to help create these relationships between different people in heritage in different places. So what we're really doing as interpreters is we're designing opportunities. We're tying exterior and interior conditions together in a brief moment so that visitors or guests whose background we understand can create great experiences for themselves. That's important to mention. They're creating great experiences for themselves. So in this webinar, we want to show you how planning is carried out to produce not just the results for individual guests, but even for communities as well. None of you guys who are visiting us have to be an interpreter or even inspired to be one, but if you are in any way involved in protected area or tourism management, you're definitely in the right place. So if you're not in the right place, now's a good time to leave. Okay, I see nobody leaving, so let's move forward here. So to plan or design experience opportunities, we need to know certain things. We need to know our mission, even if it's just an individual person. Why are we doing this? What are the problems that the heritage place is facing? What is the heritage that we have? What are the forces, the universal forces and processes that have created this heritage and continue to transform it? And we need to know why we're offering these interpretive experience opportunities. And last, what do we want the visitor to do? What is the behavior we're looking for? And there can be quite a variety of different behaviors. It could be like donating something, or not throwing trash, or don't step off a trail, picking plants in the park, word of mouth advertising. Maybe we want them to write a letter to a politician or sign a petition. Maybe we want them to join our membership program, feel pride and self-esteem about their own heritage. Interpretation in a management context is done to achieve specific outcomes. I imagine quite a few of you are involved in management of heritage, so we use interpretation as a tool to achieve some of these outcomes. We don't do it just for enjoyment or education. That oftentimes doesn't really help the managers or the heritage. So to achieve this requires that we do some planning of our experience opportunity, and we want whoever is that. All participants could turn the microphones off. Once again, could all participants, there's a button at the top of the screen. It's green, you should press that, and then it becomes no longer green. I think it goes white. All right. So whoever that interference was is now gone. So we will continue. But if we're going to plan experience opportunities, we first need to get an idea of what is an experience. Sometimes we think we know, but there's a lot of crazy definitions out there. So this will define an experience as, first, an event. You first have to have an event. An event involves somebody doing something in a place, interacting with something, usually heritage. So we have an event. And then this event provokes a reaction in our minds, positive or negative, hopefully in our case, positive. And then this reaction, in turn, generates meaning. What is this reaction good or bad, or what am I learning about this, or what am I thinking about myself? Maybe I just jumped out of an airplane and I've overcome a great deep fear and I've made a new meaning about myself. And then all of this generates a memory. The meaning is a very important part of the memory of how we code the event and the reaction that we feel. So this entire process of an event to reaction to meaning to memory is the experience, not just doing something as we oftentimes think, especially in the tourism world. As you can see, the doing something is the activity, and that's a real small part of this overall experience. So we can also see experience as several things happening. I'll take a holistic view of an experience. 5 different spheres that are happening at the same time. There's the interpretation itself, which is provoking us into thinking and creating connections with the place, with the heritage that we're visiting. But also, you know, each person comes with this interior psychological background, their expectations, their values, maybe their fears, their biases. Everybody has them, and they influence greatly into how we interpret what we're coming into contact with. Then there's the exterior context, which we talked about, the activity, the food that we're eating, the service that we're receiving, the things that we're physically seeing, what tourism often focuses on. And then there's an interior cultural background. We all come with certain worldviews and assumptions that we share as certain kinds of groups that greatly shades and influences, again, how we interpret. And these are things that are beyond just our individual background. And then there's a social interaction, that our experience greatly depends on how we interact with other people. And oftentimes we forget that part. We usually think about individuals creating experiences, but experiences are largely social events in different ways. So way to visualize an opportunity, I always like to think of it as sort of a three-dimensional space, really a multi-dimensional space. And one way to look at it is imagine the tent of a circus. So here we have a three-dimensional or a multi-dimensional space. We can call this a metaphor for the opportunity. And there's many different aspects or dimensions within this space that we can manage to try and influence the experience that visitors create for themselves. You can see we have the infrastructure going on here. We can control that. Infrastructure is still appearing. Those are lights, so we control illumination. We can control, and that's the candy, so we can, the food and the smell of food. These are things that circuses actively control. There's the box, the ticket office, I suppose you could call it, so we can control access and the flow of people, the number of people, and the direction that the people move into the space. And then there's a series of actors that were working with us to help control. There's the master of the lion tamer and the lion. Although in Costa Rica and other countries, such animals are not allowed anymore, prohibited by law. We have a clown here who's trying to influence the experience. We have a band up here, so we're controlling the dimension of sound. The trapeze artists, movement. And then there's a series of people who are behind the scenes, a whole crew of different kinds of designers who are involved in creating and operating this space. The costume designer managing the costumes, the set designer doing the artwork and how the space is physically, how it physically appears, a choreographer and how people are moving, the chef for the food, the architect for the design of the whole tent, the music director for the sound, the writer, what's being said by the different actors and the sequence in which they say them, the engineer locating the lights and the ladders and the poles, the artist, the artwork that's everywhere on most of the surfaces, the lighting and the sound specialist, and then we have the creative director who's organizing all of the other designers. So you might be thinking, well, this seems a little bit too far away from my heritage area and my example, but in fact, most heritage areas have a variety of different designers. They don't oftentimes meet in the same place in the same time, but they do exist. You have people who are designing trails, you have other people who are designing signs, you have people who are training the park guards. The challenge is that they oftentimes are different moments they're spread out over time, which is why an experience plan or an interpretive plan is very useful, so that they can communicate with each other across time. Another aspect of helping people to develop good experiences and provoking them is to engage their total person. You want to engage their mind, the ideas and themes, information that they think about, or their head, their emotions, right, the experiences that they have, the objects that they feel, the physical activities, the tastes, and the powerful sensations that they have. The more of these things that we can activate, the more they will be provoked into thinking about the place that they are and the things that they do, and hopefully generate additional meaning in which to encode their experience. Now, it isn't just individual interpreters who do this kind of planning. We oftentimes focus on individual interpreters, but in reality, teams play an important role, especially on non-personal media like exhibits or a series of signs. You need to have designers and writers and fabricators involved. And that is pretty common because we all understand museums, but we don't often think that communities themselves can participate in designing experience opportunities, especially when it involves heritage areas, which they are heritage participants, which they feel a great deal of ownership for, and thus want to be involved in or even control the ideas that are communicated to the visiting audience. So in summary then, we help people, or interpreters help people, to deeply know the heritage that they're visiting, heritage place, hopefully help them come to love it, and help them want to conserve it. So at this point, I'll turn the microphone over to Clark Hancock, who's going to talk about how we actually do interpretation, how is it executed on the ground. Clark, take it away.
Oh. Hey, can you all hear me okay? Or we got, okay, good audio, I hope. Yes. Yay!
Yes, sir.
Technology is a wonderful thing, guys. It really is. It can help us if it works. But we don't have a fallback, so it better work today. So the question that comes up, as John was talking about, is what does the interpretive opportunity actually look like on an individual, immediate basis? What is the role of the interpreter in this whole process? If what is happening within the minds of our visitors, of our guests, then what is the role of the interpreter? I often think of it as John uses the analogy of the circus, which I love that analogy, but I also use another analogy I do is that of a play date. Anybody out there have children, you know, you're setting up a play date, you actually have to do a little bit of organization for that play date to actually happen. So we are asking others to take a moment out of their lives to take a step out of their regular life, kind of make an oasis in time and space, to spend their time investigating something different. In this analogy, the analogy of the play date, the interpreter serves as a host, preparing the place, providing activities, guiding potential experience. Again, understanding that the experience actually happens within the individual, we provide the opportunities for that experience to happen. Another analogy is to think of it as a dance. This is a dance between the individual and the heritage, the resource, where the individual takes the lead. When you start thinking about the role of the interpreter in this analogy is that of the instructor, of the coach. When they first start out, the individual may not know the steps, may not know the connections. So the interpreter then provides the guidance to get them going. But as they start practicing, as they start working, as they start making those connections, there is a flow that starts. And the interpreter is there to coach them, to suggest different ways of doing things, to look at different aspects that otherwise the individual may not have seen. This all comes from the concept that was developed back at the turn of the 20th century by a guy named Enos Mills. And I know many of you know him, and a lot of this stuff you'll see, you've seen this over and over again, but for me, this stuff is fundamental. And Enos Mills set up the first nature guide school up in the Rocky Mountains in the United States. And when he was looking at developing this nature guide school, he was looking far into the future, talking about this new profession reaching many people, and with the understanding that a person's experience will be greatly enhanced if they are accompanied by someone that can help them along the way, maybe to see things in different ways. Specifically, he was talking about nature guides, but this also applies to any cultural institution, all that, or any such place. Because as we go along, it is one thing for us to see things and we focus on things and we only experience stuff. We only recognize things that we have had some experience with in the past. But with the guide there saying, hey, look over here. Look at this. Experience this. We have a chance of enlarging our whole experience ourselves. He went on to go and say that a guide's chief aim is to arouse permanent interest. It isn't just enough for us to accompany people and have them have a good time. It is also important for us to understand that they are growing individuals, that they have a right to personal growth, and that as guides, we are there to help them along their life path. And when we start thinking about life paths, this model comes into play. It's a visitor experience model that was developed several years back by Lisa Brochu. And it's one that I've exploited quite a bit because I love the simplicity of it. Every experience we have has an entry point, the experience where connections are made, and an exit point. From that exit point, we move on to the next experience. Come on. Is it going to come up? Okay. Let's try that again. Yeah. So that one experience leads into the next experience. One exit becomes an entry into the next experience, and on and on. And this keeps on going. Oh, great. Oh, it actually, the animation works. I love it. Okay, so it actually goes through a whole series from one to the next. And very simply, this is our life path, from one experience to the next experience to the next experience to the next experience. And it is a growth pattern. The role of the interpreter in all this is to assist so that, for instance, in the entry part, our primary goal is the removing of barriers to participation. And the largest challenge for the interpretation is that removal of barriers. This does not just apply to folks that are visiting a specific site, but on all forms of communication related to this slice of heritage that we are working with. From tours to brochures, online experiences, even research projects and research reports, the interpreter identifies potential barriers and finds ways to remove them. You have to get in the weeds with this. With every site, with every interpretive product that you are creating, you have to think there from the visitor standpoint, from the user standpoint. How are they going to see this? How are they going to use this? The National Park Service had this wonderful saying that they used for a long time in the Interpretive Development Program called the visitor was sovereign. And that is an important thing. It isn't the visitor is always right, but it is always from the visitor, the guest point of view, that as interpreters, we look at how to present an experience to them. You have to get into the weeds on this with every project, but there are some basic guidelines to consider. And one of those is John's 5 spheres. As you look at all the baggage that people bring with them into an experience, understanding where that comes from, understanding where their starting point is. Oh, wow. That's a finger. That's not an E. That's supposed to be an E. It said enjoyable. Oh, well. Okay. So one of the important parts in some of the basics when we start talking about removing barriers to participation are to make things enjoyable. we are creating situations where folks are willing to put aside, just for a short period of time, the cares of their world. This allows them for just a moment, just that moment, to be open to seeing things in a new or an enhanced way. Is it enjoyable for them? Can they relax for just a minute? Can they are they engaged personally? How are they engaged using a multisensory approach so that they have different ways to engage with the resource, the heritage? It also, I love this. Okay, all right. John, I messed up the font. Okay, right. I should have known better. We were having a discussion last night about fonts, and I had this decorative font I was using, and that has decided not to translate well into the presentation. So this word is supposed to be relevant. People respond. People respond better to things that relate directly to their knowledge or experience. In the study of neuroscience studies, it is being pointed out time and time again that our brains do not recognize things that we are not already familiar with. If we are familiar with something in some way, then our brains will recognize that pattern and pick up on it. But if we're not familiar with it, then we don't recognize it right off the bat. This becomes the role of the interpreter, to transition from a point, help people transition from a point where they have a relevant experience into something that is new. Is it relevant to them? Finally, one of the third things, is it organized? The more someone has to mentally go through gymnastics to be involved in an opportunity, an interpretive opportunity, into an interpretive experience, the more chances are they will not jump through those hoops. Those barriers will be created. So our job is to create a flow through that particular oasis of time and space, that flow that takes them from the beginning to the end, so that they can spend their awareness not on what do I need to do, but on the experience itself. Those three things, T, O, R, and E, those form the basis of every experience that we have in our life that is memorable. In some way, they were organized, they were relevant to us, and they were enjoyable. What makes interpretation a step further is that when we bring in themes, the idea of a unifying thought, a unifying structure throughout the experience. This provides organization and direction, leading to focus and understanding. It isn't just for the participants' sake, but it is also for our sakes as interpreters and our organizations, to clearly have an idea of what is important about this slice of heritage that we're working with. What are the various ways that we can approach this and see it and that it is relevant to our visitors and to our world? This is where the theme comes into play. Okay. All right. I've really got to work on my slides here. All these, T-O-R-E, comes from Sandham's work, and can be found in Interpretation Making a Difference on Purpose. And if you have not had access to this book, or you haven't seen this before, I strongly urge you to get it, because this gives you some concrete ways to start looking at the interpretive experience through a thematic formula. So what are the traits of a theme? I talked about theme there. What are the traits of a theme? Why is it important? And using the theme as the structure by which the interpretive experience is molded. Well, first of all, it needs to be a complete thought. And this is mental discipline. This is a way of us, this is a way for us to clearly think, what is it specifically about this heritage that we find so important? And crystallize it so that it is easily understandable. It also needs to be specific and interesting. we have a tendency, I have a tendency when looking at themes to be very general. But it is, as I've developed my skills in developing themes, I've understand that this idea of being specific and interesting, it has to relate to what is being experienced by your guest, by your visitor at your site. What is it about your site that is important? It can use universal connections, like everything on this planet leaves, every force on this planet leaves a mark. But what is it about your site that illuminates that larger principle? So being specific and interesting. The most important is that it connects what is being experienced by the visitor with the ideas that this experience may connect with, the tangible, intangible. Whether or not a site, a resource, has something ingrained in it that is important really matters very little, because what is important is how do people perceive it? Is this important for how do they connect to this resource in their lives? And through their lives, through our community's lives. And finally, the most important is, so what? Why should I care about this? It should answer that question. It should touch something within them. And what is important is that we understand that this happens not on necessarily on a cognitive level, but on a holistic level, on an emotional and spiritual level as well, where we use the power of words to connect with something that is greater than our intellect. That, as Enos Mills called it, poetic interpretation. Here's an example. This is again from Sam Hamm's book. With first, the top one, these are two themes based on the same subject matter. With every sip of this wine, the toil and the blood of our ancestors becomes part of you. The grape has a long tradition among people in this part of the world. When looking at this, the bottom one is mostly just a statement of fact. But the top one goes that extra step. It uses evocative language to create a feeling within us, create a mental image, create a picture within us. It isn't just our intellect it's working with. It is also our spiritual connection to it. As Tilden said, information is not interpretation. We can see that information is revelation based on information. And that is a very important point. We are not talking about just providing educational, how many things can you check off, how much knowledge do you have on this subject, how many birds can you identify, etc. We are saying, what is the importance of the individual, that connection, that individual connection? Where does this take you? Why is this important to you? Does this speak to you in some way as you go down your life path? Some ways to do that, this is our teach less and show more. Don't just start lecturing. Show people things. Have them experience them. Be receptive. We're asking them to be in the moment with us, or be in the moment with the heritage. We need to be in the moment as well if we are the guides taking us there. We focus the guest's attention. We use our ability as guides to help people see things in new and enhanced ways. We look and experience first and talk later. Experiencing the resource, providing that poetic interpretation, that image, the visual image, and then we bring in the words. And finally, among all other things, we need to have a sense of joy in the whole process. It must permeate us. They will see from us, our guests will see from us, whether it is in our writing, whether it is in our brochures, whether it is in our personal interactions, the joy we have in developing our own connections with this resource, that they may then use as a pattern to help them make their own connections. As Brenson said, make visible what without you had never been seen. And then when we look into it, for me, that is the essence of interpretation, is to help people see things in new and enhanced ways. For the chief aim of interpretation is provocation. It isn't instruction, and by provocation we're talking about going along a continuum, the interpretive continuum. Again, this is taken from materials developed by the National Association for Interpretation, but it's the idea of being dragged from where is the starting point, whether you're just dragged along by your spouse going to a place, or you're, okay, I really want, your friend really wants to go someplace and you're just as a friend will go there, or you have to make a decision to go, to get up off the couch and go do something. To your sparking curiosity, awareness, understanding, care about, care for. The idea is to develop this continuum as you develop more and more experiences. Remember back to being relevant to something that has been, that you've had experienced before, into this idea of stewardship, that this heritage is important to me and that I will do something about it. It is important to remember that the entry point to all of this depends on where the individual is, what baggage they have, what life experiences they have. They may be at the very bottom dragged along, or they may be at the very top. They're already caring about it. And how do we get them to the next stage, which is actually investing of their time and treasure in the stewardship of that resource? So understanding where the person is coming from and where you would like them to go, what avenues are you going to provide to them to go to the next step, are essential. Because all along this continuum, we are developing community. If you notice, this goes from the individual into caring about and caring for, which means participating with others. And that becomes one of the key aspects of interpretation. It isn't just enough for someone to go along their life path. Humans are communal animals, and as such, we have to work together. So our heritage sites, if they're important to us as individuals, they also need to be important to us as communities. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Marisol, if that's okay. Marisol, you ready?
I am ready. Thank you, Clark. Hello and greetings everybody from cold and rainy Costa Rica. I hope you're doing well. So to put a little bit of this in context, I assume many of you, we are working on a site where we have very special heritage to take care of. We probably chose this career we are in because we identified with that heritage and the site's mission, and we want to honor and protect it, right? And while we're trying to do our job well, we get visitors, lots of them sometimes. Now, in my experience working with biologists and park guards over the years, for many of them, dealing with visitors, to say it nicely, it's a hassle. Some have even called this connection between visitors and heritage a complicated relationship. And I think we all know what a complicated relationship can get us to, right? So others have noted trends and created new terms to describe their situations with visitors, like over-tourism, with some calling visitors a plague. And this article from the Wall Street, for example, they talk about the Lord of the Rings effect, as tourists have inundated places like New Zealand, trying to follow Frodo's steps, more like an army of orcs, I guess. But despite all these conflicts, I have also seen and experienced many sites that have managed to turn this inevitable convergence of curious and sometimes uneducated minds and our precious heritage into interpretive experience opportunities, like Clark and Jon mentioned and described very nicely before, with which has also been documented in other places. And now for those of you who could be interested, I can provide you with a few particles, if you want. Now we know that the characteristics of heritage and visitors are different in each place, and so the approach for interpretive opportunities will vary according to those conditions. What works in one site will not necessarily do for another one. That is why it's so important to know and understand your audience and your site, and keep profiling your audience. Because that way, managers can make allies of their guests for heritage protection as opposed to seeing them as the enemy. You don't have to push them away, but instead use the tools that interpretation offers to get the best outcome out of your visitors. So what kind of outcomes can we expect from our interpretive efforts? Over the years, there has been a conversation about how much we can achieve with interpretation. There are certainly many opinions about it because interpretation overlaps with other disciplines, but I'd like to present and illustrate some of them here. So probably most of the documented cases show how interpretation supports heritage conservation and management. One case that illustrates this is a study developed in the Petrified National Forest in the United States, where there was a high incidence of petrified wood theft. It is relatively easy for visitors to grab a piece of this petrified wood as a memento. So they often told themselves that it was just a little piece, so small that taking it would not hurt anyone. But park estimates show that visitors stole approximately 12 tons of petrified wood each year, piece by piece, which of course cost the park greatly, as it would be nearly impossible to recover that heritage. So to deal with that, they developed 3 types of interventions. A sign, like the one you can see here, that's kind of old photograph. A signed pledge by visitors, and the presence of uniformed volunteers who would be over there with people, talking to them, kind of taking care of heritage. And that helped to reduce greatly the petrified wood stealing. Another example of an outcome of interpretation has to do with visitor management. Because you can manage to protect heritage, as in the example before, but also to protect visitors, sometimes from themselves. As Jon mentioned before, the signs do not represent interpretation by themselves, but instead they should be part of a larger strategy. When a study developed in Yosemite National Park tested, for example, message effectiveness and the effect of visitor familiarity on attention, risk perception, and compliance with food storage regulations in order to avoid their human conflicts. You can see there, again, an example of a sign, again, part of a strategy. So they use different experimental communication and interpretation treatments to figure out the best approaches to make people store food in order to avoid damage to their property or to themselves. One more outcome could be financial support. In this case, the Galapagos Conservation Fund has raised over $6 million from Lindblad Expeditions, an agency that takes visitors and work with them through interpretive programs. So they have high quality interpreters that make visitors feel involved and ultimately happy to donate. And well, this is a classic big example of what you can achieve, but you can achieve this outcome to a much smaller scale level. You have seen on it, you might even have donation boxes, for example, at the end of exhibits, and that's a way of getting financial support and donations from your visitors too. Another outcome, a good one, it could be volunteering. For example, in Fire Island Lighthouse Preservation Society in New York, in the United States, they recruit volunteers to participate in interpretive programs, partially because of the interpretive experience they have there. So they feel excited to be part of this, and they want to get more, and they become volunteers. Now, another important interpretive outcome that, oops, sorry, wrong way, that not everybody recognized, but several authors have proposed is having interpretation as part of a community development strategy, which would allow the strengthening of local pride and identification with heritage. And to highlight this connection between heritage and community identity, I would like to show you this quote from Irina Bokova, a former Director General of UNESCO, who said, "At UNESCO we believe there is no choice to make between saving lives and saving cultural heritage. Protecting heritage is inseparable from protecting populations because heritage enshrines people's identity. Heritage gives people strength and confidence to look to the future. It is a force for social cohesion and recovery. This is why protection of heritage must be an integral part of all humanitarian efforts." She talked about this about the criticality of heritage to community identity and development. That happened when there was a huge heritage loss since the beginning of the conflict in Syria. Now, interpretation could play a fundamental role to strengthen these connections between communities and heritage, but it has to be available to communities. In many places, and particularly in developing countries, many see interpretation as a professional service provided to visitors to enhance their experience and develop positive connections to a site, like Jon mentioned before. They see it as a special service for tourists who can pay for it, a luxury that in many cases locals cannot afford. Now, from a social justice perspective, or what I call interpretive justice, the involvement of communities, regardless of their social status, would allow them to have access to the development, implementation, and also the enjoyment of interpretation in protected areas or touristic sites, not only as providers, but also as consumers of those same interpretive experience opportunities. It's important because otherwise there's no way the communities can get involved. And even though it might be a challenge, as not everybody is accustomed to involving communities in this process, it is not as hard as it might seem. So every day we find more examples of local initiatives to develop interpretive programs with and for the local people. For instance, some of my university students here in Costa Rica have done their graduation projects working with fishermen, with elders, or young people from marginalized communities. And it has worked. Others develop their work through NGOs, like in this case in Bolivia. That was presented as a webinar, actually from PUP a few weeks ago. And this was about working with communities to develop local interpretive products. in a major scale. And another example from Colombia, we have they have developed, the government is carrying different workshops with national parks and surrounding communities to develop interpretive frameworks that will lead to the development of interpretive products for the parks and the surrounding communities too. In this case, a local artist created and illustrated the memoir of the interpretive framework, and that has been going in several parks already. So these are just a few examples of how you can put interpretation to work for your site and your visitors that go beyond the creation of experience opportunities to actual actions and outcomes that visitors can perform. Now I'm going to get back to Jon so he can give you an overview of the and conclusions of this presentation. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to just summarize what we've seen so far, that interpreters create opportunities for guests to create for themselves great experiences with heritage. And part of that great experience is to think deeply about their relationship to heritage and forge new connections and strengthen ones that may already exist. And then Clark talked a bit about the theory of interpretation itself and how it's supposed to work and how the attitude of the visitor. And that would bring us to the last section where we want visitors to feel compelled to participate in the conservation and management of heritage, to perform certain actions while they're visiting that heritage in favor of protection and protecting themselves too, to make donations, to offer themselves as volunteers and other outcomes that Marisol has illuminated. And importantly, just so we don't forget about communities, interpretation can help communities build pride in a place where they might not have had it previously. It can change their self-image, which is critical for development, as Irina Bokova had mentioned. Communities that are depressed are less likely to take initiative than those that feel empowered to protect their own heritage. So the next time someone suggests that you interpret a trail, hopefully you realize that interpretation doesn't just stop with signs. Effective interpretation actually reaches people's spirits. Thank you very much for listening in. And I guess now would be an opportunity to take some questions. We have a few minutes left in this presentation, so if you'd like to turn on your microphone and ask the question verbally, you're certainly welcome, or you can also write messages in the chat box. While you're coming up with those questions and writing them down, Emily has a few words as well to share.
Thank you, Jon, Clark, Marisol, and Tiago. I just wanted to jump in while we're taking some questions and really thank you for being part of this partnership with NAI. I realized at the beginning that I had not had an opportunity to share with you very much about the National Association for Interpretation. And so if you're not familiar with who we are, we're the Professional Heritage Interpretation Association in the States. And we love to engage with people all across the world and help grow heritage interpretation. So if you're interested in learning more about professional development opportunities from webinars to conferences to certification, I would really invite you to check out our website. So with that, it looks like there's some great things that are coming in through the chat, and I will lead it back to Jon to facilitate the Q&A.
There is a little person at the top of your menu bar who's holding his hand up or her hand up. If you want to press that, we'll know that you want to say something as well, in addition to what you might be typing. So feel free to press that button if you have a question for any one of us. Okay, I see one coming in for Marisol from Jim Barbarak. He says, to achieve interpretive justice, do interpretive planners need to develop distinct themes and approaches for local, national, international audience, or just tweak themes for different audiences?
Okay. I would say they should involve the communities to come up with those themes. Remember that it is very hard because you have so much room and time and resources to develop scenes and exhibits and tours. So the way you choose those themes, it says a lot about your site and about the way you involve people, because the narrative can vary greatly depending on who's making the decision. So I think the interpretive justice comes with the whole process of planning, developing to a certain extent, and of course enjoying the interpretation.
I would add that once the community does get involved in that, then the themes that emerge will be ones that reflect their interests very oftentimes, thus become more representative.
Yeah, I would like to add to that. That is the development of themes themselves. While they will start with the individual interpreter, for them to be effective, they have to involve representatives from the audience that they're working with, the visitors they're working with, to see if they actually work. And so it becomes a leap from the individual to the community. And the development of those themes actually is key to developing community and a sense of involvement.
So we have another question arriving from Guyana. How do you motivate citizens to be interested in appreciating heritage as a whole, especially in societies that are divided in one way or another? And then a second question, also, what role does historical science play at public sites? If anyone would like to take the first shot at that.
This is a key to the role of the interpreter. We as individuals have our own points of view. We as interpreters have our own prejudices, the way we look at it. But when we step into the role of the interpreter, we are placing ourselves secondary to the interest, the point of view of the visitor, of the guest. So we are figuring out where they're starting from and figuring out ways that they can improve along their life path. So that when they see an interpreter, they should not see a official of one side or another. They should see a person in the center, a facilitator. And that becomes extremely important, especially in divided societies. When it comes to historical signs at historical sites, the important thing is to tell the whole story, not just the story from one point of view or the other. I look at Civil War, United States Civil War battlefields, and I see monuments put up at a certain time in our history celebrating Confederate generals and stuff. And beside those, I see the sign panels that tell the story of how that particular monument came up. It wasn't and there was also the story of the soldiers, but it's a story of the resource itself, what you see there. So there is a full context that this is placed within. I hope that's helpful. Okay.
Mm-hmm. You might also think that most societies are divided these days, one way or another. And there is no one block of people called citizens. There's many different groups within citizens with different levels of motivation. Most of the time, interpreters encounter somewhat self-motivated people who arrive at heritage sites. You know, if they arrive, they already have some kind of motivation for being there. Sometimes it's internal, sometimes it's external, like a school group who's obligated to go. In other cases, you want to reach segments of your society who would never normally come to a heritage area, and that oftentimes requires other strategies and invokes other kinds of communication. It can be certainly using television, using radio, using signage on the streets. Right here in San Jose, Costa Rica, there's a series of signs trying to motivate the population to be more concerned about ocean protection by a nonprofit that's here. So there's a variety of different kinds of media depending on which group you want to reach and what message you want to get across. I think Clark's answer about historic signs was pretty good.
And again, an important part to remember here is like get to know your audience. What are their interests, and how can you frame that theme, like their narrative, in a way that you can present it to them, that it will be interesting, but also that you can present a different view if that's appropriate, so they can expand their thinking.
Nirvana has a second question about techniques to deter activities at sites, vandalism, pilfering. And there is a lot of research done on influencing visitor behavior at at heritage sites. There's a variety of different techniques that are used. One that we didn't mention, but we thought about including, was another study done in Australia, which showed that certain kinds of signs were able to, interpretive signs were able to influence people picking up aluminum cans, litter, and they even were able to influence people picking up aluminum cans of somebody else that they weren't even when they encountered it along the way. There's other research and strategies used by interpretive park guards, where there was a comparative study between the park guards. If I can remember this, there was like 3 different subjects. Jim Barbarack might know this one, so feel free to add if you do, Jim. One of the treatments was the park guards giving what do you call it, like a no, the word is, like they gave them a fine or a warning, a formal warning. I just lost the word in English. There was one. Another one, the citation. Thanks very much. Thanks for the translation, Jim. And then another one was like handing out flyers. And then the third one was the park guard actually trying to engage in an interpretive talk to explain why a certain rule existed. And they compared the results of these 3, and they found out for at least certain kinds of audiences doing certain kinds of behaviors that the interpretive talk, or at least the explanatory talk, was more effective. And then there's a whole series of different kinds of interventions which are passive, like building walls and barriers, and there's lots of ways to manipulate the environment which can influence people's behavior. So there isn't a quick answer. It helps. You have to know the audience, you have to know your environment and the behavior that you're trying to achieve.
That's so important because you have to experiment. Not in some cases the public is more educated and they get it easier. Sometimes it takes a lot of work, and you have to start from very low expectations and standards and work your way up. But nobody can tell you exactly how a recipe, because they will vary from place to place. So you'll have to adjust to your audience.
A lot of times,
this comes.
Go ahead, Clark. Yeah.
Yeah, this comes down to something very basic too, because there's the old adage: you cannot legislate stupidity. You cannot create rules and all that people are going to act dumb. They're going to act stupid. They're going to act in certain ways. But what you can do over a long period of time is develop a community ethos, a community that says that this sort of behavior is not acceptable here. We saw that in cigarette smoking in the United States. As that progressed, how cigarette smoking now is put away from the mainstream. And we see this also in litter campaigns and the like, where over a period of time, by continually emphasizing the question and focusing on the role of personal responsibility as part of a community, that we start developing that ethic within a site that you do not do this.
Melissa, you were... Continue, Clark. I just heard a delay in your transmission.
Okay, I think that's it.
Excellent. Now, I was going to ask Melissa, who's requesting resources, if you could specify which kind of resources you're interested in receiving. We do intend, after this webinar, to send out a message to all registrants with additional resources.
And Nirvana,
I still see some other.
Nirvana mentioned sometimes a lack of enforcement, not using the laws to help protect. That's an obvious point. If you're going to pass a law, you're going to have a rule, you're going to have to enforce it. If the rule is not enforced, then the authority is not respected. So you have to be careful. Well, we have rules against this, but unless they're being enforced, unless you have a physical presence on the ground, reminding people, don't do this, there are consequences to this, then the rule may not even be there, and it actually becomes detrimental in the long run.
Hello. Maybe now you could speak. Okay. So Jim Barbarack writes, authority of the resource is a technique for non-confrontation encounters between protected area and conservation agency staff and visitors or individuals not following rules, but not to be used in situations where infractors are armed and dangerous. I guess that would require a different kind of authority approach where they're armed and dangerous. Other comments or questions?
Again,
Clark, yes?
Jim's statement points out the need for the idea of community. It isn't just your agency or your staff. It has to be connected with the other agencies and staff within your area. You have to have these connections. Our sites are not islands. Well, they are islands. They're islands, but they're islands that are connected to larger communities. We would like to think that they're separated, but they're not. So making sure that roles, and this is where interpretive planning comes into play, is whose responsibility is it to, and master planning comes into play, whose responsibility is it? What is the procedures when certain circumstances arise so that your staff can react to that in an effective way?
Yes. Anil, if you'd like to try again, we've been hearing feedback from your microphone, but if you've resolved that issue, go ahead and try to talk. And please mute your speakers and while you're trying to speak. Maybe that might help. Go for it. Anil? Okay. Otherwise, you can share the question in the chat box. Okay. Anil seems to be thinking about the situation at the moment. So, well, we did originally propose 12:20, at least Costa Rican time, and we're just about at that point. So, see if there's any more, or if Emily has any final words, I'll pass that back to you as well.
I don't. It looks like perhaps Nirvana may have an additional question, but we're going to invite you to stay online for just a few moments. When the webinar concludes, we'll close out the session, and then a short survey will pop up, and that will be helpful for our presenters. Otherwise, we invite you to join us for future TAPAS, PUP, or NAI sessions, and once again, we really thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Nirvana, and your staff from Guyana, as well as all the other folks.
Good luck with your visitors.
Yeah. Well, certainly, Anil, feel free to email us afterwards as well. and we will soon be sending you a link to this recording.
Hello. Is it audible for you people? Hello.
Hello. Yes.
Yeah. So I'll just go ahead in terms of communicating it because I'll be switching off the speakers for a while. The message here is like on the World Heritage Sites, the case study what we are trying to do as a scholars of tourism cloud is, we are trying to engage in an activity called Plantation Festival during every rainy season.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I understand you, but you want to write something into the chat box. In any event, thank you all once again. And soon as you leave this chat room, you'll get a survey pop up automatically on your browser, and we very much appreciate it if you could fill it out.
Okay. It looks like Anil previously had sent a case study that she is working on for, where was that? A plantation festival in India, Pakistan, Nigeria, Ghana. Connecting platform for tourism, travel and hospitality, academia and industry to field level sustainable tourism. Wish to make tourism cloud presentation festival in your country in the world. She then went on to say, with this initiative, am I engaging tourists and communities in interpretation? I am doing this as an activity currently. And my response would be, yes, you are involving them in interpretation. If anything else, you probably are introducing them to the concept of interpretation.
All right. Well, I think we have had an opportunity to take some great questions and responses. Once again, we want to thank you all for joining us. I'm going to close out the webinar room, and as long as you allow pop-ups, a short survey should pop up, and you can share with us a little bit more about perhaps future webinars you'd like to see or just some feedback from the presenters as a whole.